Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. And this is our sixth VR talk. Very excited. My name is Xindeling Pan, a creative director at IBM, also one of the lead organizers at MediVis. It's a pleasure today to be your host and moderator. We are going to learn a lot about augmented reality for interventional suite from our speakers in the next hour. And just a heads up, this talk will be recorded and posted on YouTube later, so you can always come back and rewatch it or share the replay with your friends. And for today's talk, we have three wonderful speakers from Philips with us today. Leili Flexman, Department Head of Precision Diagnosis and Imaging-Guided Therapy. Then we have Leili Salehi, PhD and scientist, and Ashish Panse, also a scientist and PhD. Welcome. In terms of logistics, this talk is going to be an hour long. We have about 40 minutes panel time and 15 minutes Q&A at the end. I believe our speakers do have to drop or have a hard stop at 1:30 today, so we do need to wrap up. But throughout the talk, if you have any questions, please add to the Q&A tab in the Zoom chat. I believe it's located at the bottom of the Zoom app. So feel free to add questions for our speakers in that tab. Before we get started to the actual talk, I do want to do a quick introduction to MediVis and a little bit about who we are. So MediVis is a non-profit organization with the core mission of promoting education in the emerging field of immersive technologies in healthcare. We are all about sharing and developing knowledge around AR, XR, VR in healthcare. And our goal is to build a diverse community that will bring both technical and healthcare professionals together. And our major event, as you probably saw on our website, MediVis Symposium and Hackathon is targeted to take place in summer of next year. So this webinar is part of the whole year-long MediVis talk series that we are working on to lead up to our main event next summer. And of course, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors. Without them, we won't be able to make this type of thing happen. Also, a special thanks to all the MediVis organizing team who worked very hard to put this all together. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. I believe, Ashish, you were going to take over the screen share.
Thanks, Ling, for that introduction and for introducing MediVis. It's great to be part of this community, and we're really excited to share with you today both our passion for augmented reality and our passion for image-guided therapy. So in this talk, we'll spend some time at the beginning introducing the space that we work on and the various topics that we're focused on. Then we'll share what our prototype application is, and then also take some time to talk about all the other really interesting activities happening in the interventional suite where augmented reality and virtual reality are being used by others. So to start off with just some disclosures at the beginning, we are scientists for Philips. We work for Philips Research. And what we'll be sharing with you today is work in progress and a prototype. This is not a device that is approved or available for clinical use. So to start off with just an introduction as to image-guided therapy. This is a really amazing space that has developed a lot in the last, I guess 100 years is fair, but especially in the last 50 years, where procedures that were once done with open surgery are now able to be performed minimally invasively. And what that means, the best example is have an example shown here, which is valve replacement. So in the past, where that may have been done with a surgical procedure to invasively replace a certain anatomy. Now that can be done minimally invasively, where there's a small incision made in the groin to get access to the vasculature, and then navigation to the point of therapy is performed using guide wires and catheters, small thin devices that can travel through the vasculature. And then once they reach the point of therapy, then a stent or a graft or replacement device can be implanted. And what's amazing about this is that it can allow the patients to return home more quickly, open up therapy to patients who may not have been suitable for open surgery, and can advance the types of procedures that can be done with much less impact to the patient's health. And so one of the great topics that this slide shows is also how much information is available. So on the right-hand side, you can see preoperative CT images that are being fused together with intraoperative X-ray. The reason why this is important is that the physician who's performing the procedure can no longer directly look at their tool or the anatomy to understand what they're doing. So that means they have to rely on intraoperative imaging, such as intraoperative X-ray or intraoperative ultrasound, as well as preoperative imaging like CT or MR. And those two sources of information can also be fused together, as shown here in the bottom right image, where you can then visualize not only what you're doing with the tools, but also the anatomy. The other thing that's also overlaid on this image are plans. So the rings that are shown in the image are actually planned positions, for example, of the mitral valve or of the pulmonary artery, so that the physician can use that plan to then align where they place their device. And so this is the world that we are focused on. If you look at the left-hand side, it's the type of room that these procedures are usually performed in. And what you might notice is that the screen is actually the most important part of the room for the physician, because they're relying on those live images to see what's happening. There's also the interventional X-ray system that you can see on the left side, and then panels and tablets where they can interact with the system and with the images in order to manage what's happening during the procedure. I think the other thing that's important to point out is that this is a sterile procedure. And so, for example, the blue drape that you see on the patient, that's a sterile drape. And so as our AR users are adopting this technology, it's another consideration that's important in terms of how we allow for interaction and donning and doffing of the device while still accommodating this sterile consideration. So with that, I think if we move to the next slide, this sets the stage for the problem that we're solving. So when we first started on this topic, which was a few years ago, what we recognized was how much rich information was being brought to the physicians during these procedures. So we have increasing 2D and 3D information. Some of it is available preoperatively, some of it is intraoperative. And all of that information is still being channeled through our traditional user interfaces. So for example, the 2D screen, the control panels, and a keyboard or mouse. And then to loop back to that sterility consideration, when a keyboard or mouse is used, they also need to be draped to preserve sterility, or the operator needs to move out of the sterile room and then use them in a different setting. And so with that as our problem statement, we set out to understand how we would address this challenge. And if you move to the next slide, Ashish. So our mission was really to improve this interaction in the interventional suite and to bring some new tools to address some of the key challenges that our customers and our clinical partners were facing. So one thing that I'll take a little pause to talk about is how we work. And one of the things that we've adopted through this project is very physician-centric research through using design thinking. And there's a book, the pictures there in the bottom left, called Sprint. And we followed this process. And the process is really around how to iteratively refine something while bringing input in from others. And so typically the way we start is at the top of the circle, goal setting, knowledge sharing, really understanding the background. We often use external inspiration here, so looking at, Twitter, YouTube videos, really understanding what's going on around us and bringing inspiration from outside areas, so not necessarily from the same place or the same domain that you're working in. Then we work on value proposition creation, really understanding who the users are, what their needs are, what their jobs are to be done, and how we can address some of those different tasks. Then the part that we always want to jump to, which is ideation and coming up with the solutions or some of the ideas around how to solve that problem. And then we storyboard and prototype. So for us in AR, that's actually meant that we make functional prototypes that we can take out and have users experience, so that we can really get that direct input and that direct experience from the end user. So in that next stage, we collect that user feedback. In this particular project, we've been very present on show floors as a research prototype. And one of the great things about that was to be able to interact with many users and different types of users, from physicians, technicians, administrators, and also global perspectives. And then based on that feedback, we evaluate and pivot, and then decide, whether that's around exactly what we're building or exactly what the UI is. We've used it at every layer of our process. And so we just continue looping in this circle and better understanding and refining the prototype that we're building. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we focus on is really understanding what our clinicians need. And here we've sort of categorized into three major buckets. One of them is customized setup. And what we mean by that is to have some flexibility. Interventional procedures are changing in the sense that it's a very innovative space. And so in some cases, there's new procedures that are coming where they may move to different parts of the room. They also often work in teams, and so there may be multiple people in the room who all need to have a different view of the screen, or different screens available to them. In addition, this feedback around looking in too many directions to get information, and then also not wanting to take eyes and hands away from the task. And this sort of gets bundled up into what our clinicians need is the ability to configure their own view, have it be personalized to them, and to have it be right in front of them. If you've been in an OR before, or if you go to an OR in the future, count how many screens are present. Every piece of equipment that has a screen, it brings an additional need to have a line of sight to it, and to also have it close enough to actually interpret that information. And that's in tension with also having space to work and having the freedom to move around and really focus on the patient. And so what we heard from our user is, if I want to look at a high contrast or high resolution image on the screen, I ask the text to bring the monitor closer, or I have to move the monitor to the foot of the table so that I can see it. And so there's this constant struggle of how to maintain positioning in the room, sterility, but also have the best view of that screen possible. And when you're looking at a guide wire that's 0.018 inches, that becomes quite important, having that really good visibility into what you're doing. The other topic that came up as a need was around 3D visualization. And I think this is one that we see across many different activities in augmented and virtual reality, the ability to take a complex 3D data set and make it visible and interactable truly in a three-dimensional space. And so in particular to our users, one of the things that's important is the interventional X-ray is a 2D projection of the anatomy, whereas a CT or an MRI is a 3D view of that same anatomy. And one of the things that interventional radiologists and radiologists are very good at doing is making that translation between 2D and 3D. So one of the things that AR can potentially help with is helping make that translation more easily done by more people. And then also just accessing and manipulating that 3D data. And that includes planning, measuring, really interacting with the 3D data set. And one of the quotes that we heard is, the hologram gives you a better sense of what you'd be doing. And this particular operator would want to place it wherever they want and turn it at whatever angle they want, which today is possible, but that's more through an interaction with a mouse and keyboard and sort of manipulating images on a 2D screen. The third topic was around communication. And here this is two types of communication. The first one is communication inside the room, where even though you're in the same room, people may be standing in different positions, may not have access to view the same screen together. And even if they can, still need to collaboratively identify targets on that screen or talk through the information that they're seeing. And then the second, which again is a theme that shows up in augmented and virtual reality, is around telepresence, and the ability to connect from inside a room to outside the room. And in our particular case with the interventional suite, again, because of the sterility aspect, there's even benefit to being able to connect from in the room to outside the room, but not necessarily in a different place. And then further to go to being able to truly enable telepresence to a broader set of expertise. And there, we heard the feedback from the user that they want to spend less time orienting them and guiding them and really just go for the goal. You see it, I see it, okay, let's go get it. So, just sharing some of the motivation behind how we've developed the prototype and the feedback we've heard directly from our target users. So I think if we go to the next slide, I'll hand off here to Ashish and let him talk through the prototype we've created and what some of the key features are that we're developing in order to address some of these needs.
So as you saw previously, we have used the iterative design sprint process during this entire development. What I'm going to share is a few videos, some select features that we have which address the user's need. So the first thing that I will show you is this video, which is about flexible screens. You have this concept which we call as a cockpit. Basically, you can just get your screens in your headset. What we are showing here is the HoloLens 2. We spent some time developing the application on the HoloLens 2, and it was presented during during the Mobile World Congress at Barcelona a couple of years back, and these are the snippets from that video. So what you see is the physician has his own set of screens that he can move around with and put them wherever he wants in his convenient location. Moving on, what you can see is now each and every user has their own content, right? So you can see the assistant on the right side moving the screen around has her own personal screen because she wants to keep an eye on the patient vitals, whereas the physician is looking at live X-ray images in the middle screen. There is a hologram on the left screen, and the right screen has the vitals. So all of this information that is relevant to the physician is available at their convenient place to look at. And also you can see that the screens are tied to the head. So wherever they are looking, they are always in front. That's one of the modes that you can have in this screens. Moving ahead, one more thing that we have is, if you pay close attention to the bottom part, the control panel of the X-ray system is also being virtualized and is tied to the physician. So what this allows is real flexibility during the procedure. So nowadays, the physicians are trying different access points. When I say access points, it is the point where the physician inserts the catheter in. So traditionally, because of the hard setup it is very difficult to move the access points. For example, if you are looking, if you start the procedure at the thigh of the patient using femoral axis, and then now on the right side, and now you have to move on the left side of the patient and access it through the radial, means from the heart, from the hand, it is very difficult to move the entire room setup around. So what this allows is basically you can just pick up the virtual setup and move wherever you want. And that gives, that enables flexibility around the room. Moving on, this is how we are trying to solve the interactions problem. So there are so many features in the headset that you could use. We have gestures, we have eye tracking, we have voice control, and it just allows you more intuitive control of the system rather than having mouse and keyboard or physical table side modules. What you're seeing here is the physician is using gestures and tapping on virtual screens to move through images. There is eye tracking, which is available. I will be talking about this in detail in a couple more slides. Now, if you have seen, there is a big plethora of features that we want to implement in a headset. So naturally, we have a few considerations that we need to look at when we are selecting a proper headset. So we have divided these features into what the physician wants and what we would like to have as Philips. So the physician naturally wants a bigger field of view. They want a very comfortable headset. It should not be super heavy, or if it's heavy, it should be not cumbersome on your head. You should be able to see what's happening in the real world. One of the main feedbacks that we got was that the communication between the physician and the staff around is they quite frequently use eye contact. So they have to be able to maintain that during the use of augmented reality headsets. One major thing is image quality. They really would, they want the monitors that are there in the rooms are very high quality. They are very high resolution and high dynamic range. So they are used to super high quality images in the interventional suites. So that is also a major concern for them. Of course, these procedures can last anywhere between 15 minutes to 8 hours. So the battery is a concern. You need to have longer duration charges and quick charging as well. And then cleanability is also a concern. So the devices should be easy to clean in between uses and users. As Philips, what we would like to have is we should be able to cover a broad range of users based on sizes, based on glasses. What we have seen is quite a few people have very, very different glasses that they are using. So the headset should also support those glasses. The platform maturity is something that we are also looking at. So it should be easy to develop, and not just easy to develop, it should also provide the functionalities that we need, like for interactions. Environmental mapping is something which is very important for us, mainly around spatial computing. And of course, UI options should be also there. So if you see, what you see at the bottom of this slide are all the devices, are a few of the devices that we have tried. And devices, or I would also like to say X devices. And that's where we are going. We are trying anything that anything new that is coming. Now I'll talk about the interactions of what we used and what interesting things came around during development. A main thing that we used were gestures. Gesture means you have your hands tracked, like every joint track. The more articulation you can capture, the better. But there are also some drawbacks around gestures. If you saw the physicians in my previous videos, they sometimes both of their hands are busy. So, so you have to have some alternate interactions. A big feature that was very well received was eye tracking. And eye tracking is something so interesting and so intuitive until you have, like, it's not intuitive until you have used it, is what I would like to say. Because when we developed this feature, we thought we would have to train the physician a lot to use eye tracking. But when we were on the show floor and demonstrated to 350 plus users, this feature was what took the first place on the podium. I mean, our expectations was that the gestures would be amazing because we could control the hologram in any way, and it would be easy to rotate. But eye tracking took the show for us. What we had implemented was basically selecting buttons. So if you want to switch screens, you could just switch using eye gaze, and we also had image zooming. So right now, if you zoom on most of the platforms, you zoom around the middle of the image. So what we had implemented was, if you look at a certain portion, you are zooming around where you're looking. So those features were really well received. A very interesting thing about developing for eye tracking was we spent a lot of time on just fine-tuning the eye tracking. There are so many design considerations to get the eye tracking right. You have to have the right size of the object. You have to have the timing correct. You have to have some what we would like to say is gravity wells around the things that you want your eye gaze to stick to. It was a very satisfying end to the lot of time that we spent on fine-tuning the eye tracking. Then a big another way of interaction was voice. What voice allows you to do is have short commands, I would like to say. Like, for example, if you want to skip through a bunch of frames together, currently you have to push the same button multiple times. What voice gives you is you can just say skip 5 frames or show me the next video. And voice is something very important for our prototypes. Now we also have evaluated some hardware controllers. For fine manipulation, it is much easier to use the hardware controller. And then for pre-procedural, post-procedural interactions for planning, the hardware controller is very useful. Now, using all of these features, we developed the flexible screens applications, which I showed just before. But what Leili is going to show next is that we also know a lot of other companies and other fields of applications that AR and VR is being used. So over to you, Leili.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, hereafter I'm going to talk about some of the opportunities in the area of AR and VR in intervention. So as you can see, there are a lot of efforts being done by universities as well as companies in order to develop more and more applications in this area. So the applications for example, surgical training, or pre-operational planning, or intraoperative guidance of the physicians. Also, for example, patient education, which I think is one of the most important like benefits of using AR and VR, and I'm going to talk about later. So among all of these companies, we have chosen a few of them to talk about in more details today. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the applications are around like image viewing or preoperative planning or education of the medical professionals. 3 companies active in this area are MediVis with its surgical AR, which has the FDA approval, and they basically create 3D holographic displays of internal organs created from CT or MR images in order to train medical professionals or do preoperative planning. For example, they use both Magic Leap and Microsoft HoloLens as their AR platform, and also they have partnered with Verizon, the telecommunication company, in order to find applications of AR and VR which can be combined with 5G technology. The second company is NORAD with its OpenSight device, another FDA-approved device which can overlay the anatomically correct size images of the internal organs on the patient, and it can also be used for training of the medical professionals, for example. The third company is the Brainlab, and the nice thing about this product is specifically fusion of different types of imaging modalities, for example, over each other, and this is also being used for medical training, and they use a Magic Leap for their AR platform. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the next company and product are Augmented and the X-Vision. So this product kind of stands out among other products because this company has developed their own headset, AR headset, and this is being used for surgical planning in the spine area. And so the headset has received FDA approval. So their focus so far has been around spine surgeries, but they are trying to move away from that, or basically take the chance to go to other areas of the surgery. And the physician can also, using the system, track, for example, spinal screws or other surgical tools during the operation. So this system has been tested on human for the first time this year. Next slide, please. All right, so far we have talked about overlaying holographic displays of internal organs, for example, on the patient. SentiAR introduced another product which doesn't overlay the holograms on the patient, and instead of that, it creates 3D holographic displays of internal organs such as, for example, heart chambers, electrical activity of the heart, as well as the catheters, intracardiac catheters during cardiac, or more specifically electrophysiology operation, like mapping and ablation procedures. One interesting thing about these procedures is that there are always 2 people needed in the OR. One is the surgeon who manipulates the catheters, navigates them, and a mapping specialist who sits outside the operating room and basically rotates the maps and facilitates these image creations for the physician. So in this paper from developers of SentiAR, it has been shown that the navigation time, the interactions of the second person, the mapping specialist, with the map during the navigation time has been reduced when the physician is using the augmented reality. Next slide, please. So another use case of the AR is for needle guidance, which basically means that like inserting needles into some specific targets inside the body at a specific angles or orientation. This is a nice paper. The work has been done at NIH, and the summary of it is like the authors basically created virtual targets that should match with the real targets inside the phantom, as well as a virtual path or a virtual needle, as you can see on the figure B of the left-hand side figure, that basically connects the surface of the phantom to the virtual target, and the physician or the operator needs to match this path, virtual path, with their actual needle in order to reach the target, the actual target. And this paper shows that the navigation to a target using smartphone and smart glasses AR has a better precision than the CT-guided freehand approach. Next slide, please. And the last application of the AR and VR that I am going to talk about today is training and simulation. Traditionally, what is being done for training the medical professional is to use some mannequins, for example, or cadavers, or even sophisticated simulations. But I believe that the AR and VR can open a new door towards interactive training and education of the medical professionals. Two companies active in this area are CAE Healthcare with the Vimedix system, which is the most popular ultrasound simulator. They have paired with Microsoft in order to show the holographic displays of the ultrasound sequences as holograms with the Vimedix AR product. So this sequences could be simulated sequences, or they can be acquired in real time by putting some fluids inside the mannequin, which contains all sorts of different like organs and vessels inside it. And basically the medical professionals or students can create ultrasound images using an ultrasound machine and view it as holograms over the mannequin. And last but not the least is the Precision VR from Surgical Theater company, which can be used for preoperative planning, again, training of the medical professionals, and also patient education, which I said, I think is one of the nicest applications of AR and VR, because the patient can get a better understanding of their issue when they are looking at 3D displays. For example, a tumor, when they can have a better feeling of a tumor in 3D than just looking at 2D screens. And also, I think this can reduce the fear of the surgery in the patient. On the other hand, having this opportunity of going through all of these images in 3D can give the medical professionals or surgeon the opportunity to basically find the best incision locations, the shortest path to the lesion that they would like to access, and most importantly, the safest path, which can create the least amount of damage to the patient's tissue. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and we would be happy to take some questions here.
So I see that we have some questions coming in from the Q&A, so please feel free to keep adding your questions and we'll do our best to get through them. To start off, I saw an interesting question. So Julie had a question about doctors and others in the OR usually already wear headgear with special magnification capabilities. So just to comment on how wearable AR can work together with some of those other wearables. And I think this is a great question. It's something that is slightly different with the interventional case. So in minimally invasive image guided procedures, typically they aren't wearing like the loops, but they do need visibility of their screen. But also very important for those users is that they wear lead-lined glasses that protect their eyes from the radiation. And so a key need for our users is to be able to either have lead-lined wearables or to be able to wear the existing lead-lined glasses underneath the wearable. So that's a consideration, and I think not directly related to our topic, but that we've heard and seen in other spaces is either being compatible with the loops or also incorporating some other wearable functionality like the surgical lights that they sometimes have on their head as well. So I think there's a whole future path of how we support the multiple wearables as we move forward. So I think in another question that we'll touch on, there was a question around from Florian around physicians and whether they had feedback after using the prototype for a longer time and dealing with gorilla arm and the physical exhaustion because of gesturing. So Ashish, do you want to comment on that one?
Yes. Yes, we definitely got the feedback about gorilla arms and physical exhaustion when you're using gestures alone. That's where using all the gestures in combination and voice control is very important, right? But in some cases, gestures give you finer controls of things. Like if you want to set collimation, when I say collimation, it's like cropping. Yes, right? If you want to crop your X-ray image, the gestures give you more fine control, just like you would do on an iPad or your touch screens. Sometimes touching buttons is also easier than using voice commands. Yeah, that's where it's not just one. That's where you have to be very judicious about use of your gestures alone.
I think there's also an interesting trend to add to this. So what we've seen is that the headset manufacturers are starting to increase the range of the depth sensors to do the gesture recognition. So what that helps with is that you don't have to raise your arm up into the field of view, and you can have it in a more comfortable position. But the trade-off with that is that what we see are more false gestures. So, things that they're doing with their hands that aren't intended to be part of their interaction with the AR start to manifest as some command. So I think it's also a trade-off of sensitivity to a specific task versus comfort. And in general, the other thing we learned is when we made things actionable by both eye gaze and gesture, that by the time someone even got their hand ready to go, they were already, say, pushing the button through their eye gaze. So there's some interesting interplay in some of these trade-offs as UI design progresses. Let's go to another question. So there were some early questions around interactions from Charlie. Leili, do you want to just touch on the different types of interactions that we provide in the prototype?
Sure. So we have developed applications to consider, take into account eye gaze, gesture, and voice commands. But normally the physicians do not need all of them during the operation. They can use 2 of them, for example. They can look at some portion of the image they can use the eye gaze for this purpose, and then say zoom in. So it's the voice command, and then the image will be zoomed in the area that they were looking at. So yes, we have all 3 interactions developed.
Thanks, Leili. And then there was a question from Trong around what the latency is of the hologram. This is actually an incredibly important topic because we're trying to demonstrate a live image feed. The latency is quite relevant. As a rule of thumb, I think we generally in healthcare try to get below 200 milliseconds, ideally even lower than that, for the whole image chain. So, we want to make sure that that latency is as low as possible and we're not introducing any additional delays. And for that reason, it also requires like having some discipline about how much we're trying to convey at the same time. I think this is also going to be an area where we see a lot of change down the road as 5G connects into these devices and opens up more opportunities for that transmission of information from a PC, for example, to the headset. Moving on to another question. I think there was a question also from Julie around training and what kind of training we expect. Ashish, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Am I mute? No, okay. So yeah, training was mainly around gestures, probably only because if I go back in the days of development of HoloLens 1, the pinching gesture was probably the hardest to use and to teach. Then we tried the meta. I think the meta gestures were just not as responsive when we tried it. And even on the HoloLens 2, the gestures were the hardest to train with. I would say a similar experience with Magic Leap. The difference was that Magic Leap, we ended up developing our own gestures. Surprisingly, eye tracking, we did not have to even tell the physicians or whoever experienced the demo. They just got it right away. And voice control, everybody uses Alexa and Google Home and Siri, so we didn't have to teach that much about that, but we did have to put voice cues of commands in our applications doing that.
And I would add two comments here. So one is, we've tried to simplify our application. The reason why is then there's less recall required to know the different commands. Even then, it's still hard for people to automatically remember all the voice commands. So just sort of putting it out there for the community that there is a need for tools to train and to support that kind of recall in any application that uses voice commands. And one area where we have tried is gamifying some of the training process. So in some of our earlier experiments, we actually had users play a game to learn our gestures and our voice commands. And that was a way to have people, we studied how quickly they learned and could complete the tasks, but also whether that was a good way to train. And like Ashish mentioned, what we learned there was that it took the longest to learn gesture. The other things were learned much more quickly. But that was also with the HoloLens 1, which was a much more difficult gesture to learn. So I think it's a very interesting area for exploration and for people looking for topics to explore. It's one that will be present as we move forward as an AR community. Okay, I see there are a couple questions around registration. So let's touch on that one. So our application doesn't require registration to the patient. Leili described some other applications that do. In our application, we actually chose not to have to be registered really accurately because we felt that it was a more suitable starting point. And so we need good room tracking so that the screens that they're looking at don't suddenly jump to a different position. But the way we've also de-risked that is that we've made it very easy to place your screens again if you need to. So if you've got them positioned in a certain place and your room tracking changes, you just need to be able to reposition them quickly. So that's been our mitigation. And at this point, we don't actually overlay on the patient, unlike some of these other examples. That is also an area where there's a lot of research happening. And I think we gave a few places, some publications and some companies that are doing that overlay. And there's quite a few good papers out there that talk about different techniques to do that overlay, to preserve it, and to make it faster. So I would suggest taking a look at some of the literature if that's a topic that's of interest.
And a similar thing, there are a few questions about instrument tracking as well. So a similar thing goes for that. Quite a few people are experimenting with different techniques to track instruments. There are existing devices which use optical tracking, not necessarily augmented reality devices, but it's a matter of time that optically tracked devices will come into product. In fact, Augmented is using optical tracking for tracking the devices and the patient.
Thanks, Ashish. I think there was also a question coming in around eye tracking. Did you want to touch on that one as well?
Yes, so eye track, there is a question from Lance about eye tracking, I believe, about eye tracking on HoloLens 2 is not available without being in experimental mode. So I don't think we ever had to go into experimental mode for the HoloLens 2. If you use the MRTK SDK that is open source, there is a checkbox in, there is a checkbox in Unity project settings, which you just click and you can have enable eye tracking. You don't have to go into experiment mode for that.
Okay, and then Leili, do you want to touch on the question about the headsets?
Yeah, we received a question from Mr. Siddiqui, I think, about the weight of the headsets, if the physicians kind of complain about the weight of the headset. So this is something that I am sure that manufacturers are working on it. And they are trying to provide the best experience for the physicians for longest time in the operating room. They are trying to make these headsets ergonomically comfortable for the physicians and as lightweight as possible. So in the studies that we do, we constantly ask this about the questions for how long they feel comfortable, for how long they would use it, and so on. So we can get more information in this regard as we go towards more studies and longer studies probably in the future.
I think what's also interesting is that right now devices are being developed, at least in the first round, with a certain consumer focus. And as those same manufacturers are looking towards other types of users, they're also looking to us as a community to bring insights around what's actually needed and what are some of these configurable solutions that we can offer to different types of users. I think what's promising in the interventional space is that We've been asking users about this for the last few years, and there's a willingness to wear the headset. So they're not overly concerned, certainly with the latest round of devices, about the weight, but it becomes a trade-off about wear time versus comfort. And so I think right now we'd be looking at, you know, an hour and a half type wear time or less, just given both the battery life and the weight of the device. So it's something that it just ends up being a trade-off at some phase in the decision. All right, there's a question also from Eric around audio cues and how that becomes part of the UI. Ashish, do you want to touch on that one?
Yeah, so I want to tell you a story around this. So when we started developing on the HoloLens 1, it was my first time developing on anything in 3D. So we came up with a prototype. I developed some screens and we had buttons, but nobody knew who was clicking the buttons. So when we expanded the project, we hired a video game developer, and that's where he brought all his flair of video game development into the application. It was a game changer, I would say. So even though we can't do like physical touch haptics, I think audio haptics plays a very big part in these interactions, as long as you don't overdo, which also I'm guilty of doing. So yeah, audio is super important.
Okay, and then we'll probably just do one last question, given the time. There was a question around the sterility, and I think this is a great question to touch on because it comes up a lot. In our scenario, the glasses don't need to be sterile. So currently, the eyeglasses that physicians would wear are not sterile. Therefore, they can't be touched. That's the biggest implication. So what it means is we don't need to sterilize the headset. We do need to clean it. So we need to be able to wipe it down and, you know, keep it clean, likely with alcohol. But we also need to make sure that once the headset is on the user, they don't have to touch it. And that actually ends up being this more complicated part, I would say. Also trying to adjust someone else's headset is actually really difficult. So we need to make sure that they can don it before they put their sterile clothing on and gloves, and then not touch it again. If they need to touch it, they have to take their gloves off, touch it, and then re-sterilize. So that's not something we want in the workflow. So I think it's a good consideration that we always have to keep in mind as we develop in this space. With that, I think we'll probably sign off. Apologies for any of the other questions that we couldn't get to, but we'll be happy to follow up with you offline. I'll hand it back to Ling at this point.
Thanks, Molly and Leili and Ashish. It was a great discussion and a lot of wonderful questions. Very engaged panel. Let me actually take over the screen. So before we close, I do wanted to give a quick intro to our next talk. It's not on the website yet, but you will receive an email about this talk very soon. So in this next webinar, we have two experts, Dr. Chuck Martin and Mina Fahim, will share their insights and perspectives from their experiences using AR during surgery and the creation of usable AR for surgery. I believe it's going to be a fantastic one, so please sign up once registration opens. Again, a big thanks to our speakers today and everyone who joined us. It's certainly a great discussion, and this talk will be posted on YouTube in the next few days. If you have any questions or feedback for us, you can find us on our website or follow us on social media like Twitter. So with that, I'm going to close for today. Thank everyone for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.